February 19, 1945, Green Beach, Iwo Jima. The air isn't just air anymore. It is a choking, lethal cocktail of sulfur, cordite, and pulverized volcanic ash. You are lying face down in black sand that feels like granulated sugar mixed with lead. Every time you try to move, the sand collapses, dragging you deeper into the kill zone. To your left, a Marine machine gun team is desperately trying to set up a standard M1919A6. This is the backbone of American infantry support, a 32-pound anchor of steel that represents the best the Marine Corps could offer. But on this beach, the best is a death sentence. You hear it. The slow, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the American gun. 400 rounds per minute. It sounds like a tired office clerk punching a time card in a quiet room. It is the sound of the past trying to survive in a future that has already moved on. And then, you hear the response from the terraces above. The Japanese Type 99 and the hidden bunkers on Mount Suribachi answer with a sound that rips the sky open. It is a high-pitched mechanical scream. 1,200 rounds per minute. In the time it takes for you to blink, the enemy has put 3 times as much lead into the air as you have. The math of the Pacific War is brutal, and today it is final. Sergeant Mel Grevich watches from a shallow crater as a Japanese tracer catches the American assistant gunner. The M1919 goes silent. In exactly 8 seconds, an entire fire team is erased from the earth. They weren't cowards. They weren't untrained. They were simply outgunned by a factor of 3. Grevich has seen this before. He saw it at Bougainville. He watched 11 empty bunks in the last 4 weeks of training alone because the Bureau of Ordnance was sending boys to a chainsaw fight with handsaws. The system was failing, and the price of that failure was the blood of his friends. But Grevich isn't carrying a standard-issue weapon. Tucked under his arm, wrapped in a greasy waterproof canvas tarp, is a mechanical heresy. It is a 30-pound monster that shouldn't exist. It has no serial number in any official property book. It has no approved manual. It is a Frankenstein of salvaged aircraft parts and scavenged rifle stocks. It is the AN-M2 Stinger. This is the story of how a sergeant and a machinist defied the entire military hierarchy to build a weapon so fast, so violent, and so effective that the Japanese would eventually call it the monster gun. They went to the scrap heaps of Hawaii. They scavenged the scorched hearts of crashed SBD Dauntless dive bombers, pulling out aircraft guns designed to kill fighter planes in the sky. They sawed off the stock of an M1 Garand rifle and bolted it to the rear. They welded the bipod of a bar to the barrel shroud. They fabricated a trigger out of scrap metal in a shed after midnight. They built 6 of them in total secrecy, knowing that if a shore patrol officer caught them, they would be facing a court-martial for unauthorized modification of government property. He named his own weapon Betty Ann. But as the ramps dropped on Green Beach, Grevich wasn't thinking about the rules or the potential prison time. He was thinking about survival. He hits the black sand, rolls behind a small volcanic ridge, and unwraps the tarp. The gun is ugly. It is raw. It is a 30-pound metal middle finger to the bureaucracy of war. Grevich deploys the bipod. He slams a 100-round box into the side. He looks at a Japanese pillbox 70 yards inland that is currently shredding an entire platoon of riflemen. He breathes in the sulfur. He breathes out the fear. He pulls the trigger. The sound is a revelation. It is a high-pitched, terrifying howl that echoes off the cliffs of Suribachi. 1,200 rounds per minute. The tracers are a solid line of white-hot light, punching through the concrete slit of the pillbox like a laser. The Japanese gun inside stops instantly. There is no thud, thud, thud. There is only the continuous rhythmic roar of the Stinger. The Marines around him freeze in shock. They've never heard anything like it. The Japanese defenders have never felt anything like it. This is the moment the hunter becomes the hunted. This is the moment a man decided, that if the system wouldn't give him a way to live, he would build one himself with his own 2 hands. The Stinger has just taken its first bite out of Iwo Jima, and for the next 72 hours, this unauthorized monster will be the only thing that keeps the heart of G Company beating in the middle of this volcanic hell right now. November 1944. The tropical humidity of Hawaii hangs over Camp Tarawa like a damp shroud, but for Sergeant Mel Grevich, the warmth of the Pacific provides no comfort. While the rest of the 5th Marine Division sleeps, exhausted from the endless drills and the brutal rehearsals for an invasion they only know by a code name, Grevich is wide awake. He is a man haunted by a specific cadence, a slow, rhythmic thudding that he heard on the beaches of Bougainville a year earlier. It was the sound of the M1919 Browning machine gun, the pride of the American arsenal, failing to keep his friends alive. He remembers the gaps between the shots, the lethal silence that allowed Japanese soldiers to move between the bursts of fire. He remembers the 11 gunners his battalion has already lost in training, and he knows with a cold, absolute certainty that if they take those standard guns onto the next beach, more empty bunks are waiting. To the generals in Washington and the bureaucrats in the Bureau of Ordnance, the M1919 is a masterpiece of reliability. To Mel Grevich, standing in the shadows of the motor pool, it is a liability that fires too slowly and weighs too much. He needs a miracle, and he knows exactly where the miracles are kept. They are kept in the graveyard. Camp Tarawa is surrounded by the debris of a 2-year war, a sprawling salvage yard filled with the broken bones of aircraft that didn't make it back. This is the place where the metal goes to die. But for Grevich and his companion, Private First Class John Little, it is a treasure trove of unauthorized potential. Little is a machinist, a man who understands the world in terms of tolerances, metal hardness, and mechanical efficiency. He doesn't see scrap, he sees components. Together, they move through the perimeter fence, slipping past the bored gaze of the night sentries. They are committing a crime. Under the Articles of War, scavenging government property for unauthorized modification is a direct path to a court-martial. But the fear of a military prison is nothing compared to the fear of the black sand. They reach the section of the yard where the SBD Dauntless dive bombers are stacked like cordwood. These aircraft were the workhorses of Midway and the Solomons, but now they are just mangled shells of duralumin and plexiglass. Grevich leads the way toward a crumpled fuselage, its tail section sheared off and its cockpit charred by fire. He isn't looking for the engine or the radio. He is looking for the heart of the beast. Mounted in the rear of these aircraft were the ANM-2 machine guns. These are not infantry weapons. They were never meant to be carried by a man. They were designed to be bolted into the vibrating steel mounts of a warplane, fed by massive ammunition tracks and fired by electrical solenoids at a staggering 1,200 rounds per minute. While the standard infantry gun plodded along at 400, the ANM-2 was a high-speed chainsaw of lead. It was lighter, shorter, and infinitely more violent. Grevich reaches into the darkness of a cockpit, his hands slick with hydraulic fluid and old grease. He feels the cold, heavy steel of the receiver. It is smaller than the infantry version because it was designed for the cramped spaces of an aircraft, and it lacks the heavy, cooling jacket of the ground-based Brownings. This is the key. The ANM-2 is cooled by the 300-mile-per-hour slipstream of a diving plane. On the ground, it is a ticking thermal bomb, but Grevich doesn't care about sustained fire. He cares about the first 3 seconds of a gunfight. He cares about the moment a Japanese pillbox opens its shutter and shreds a platoon. In that moment, he doesn't need a reliable typewriter. He needs a lightning strike. Little hands him a wrench, and they work in a feverish, disciplined silence. They are not just mechanics. They are rebels. They are extracting the first of 6 receivers they need for the project. Grevich has calculated the math. 6 platoons in G Company, 6 Stingers, 1 high-speed monster for every group of 40 men. If they can get these guns working, they can provide a wall of lead that no enemy can advance through. They pull the first receiver free, the metal groaning as it leaves the wreckage of the Dauntless. It is a raw, industrial object, stripped of its spade grips and its electrical wiring. To anyone else, it is a useless part from a dead plane. To Grevich, it is the only way his squad makes it home. They move from wreck to wreck, their flashlights hooded with red filters to avoid detection by the MP patrols. They find the second receiver in a wingtip mount, the third in a pile of salvaged turret parts, and the fourth buried under a stack of perforated aluminum panels. Each time, the tension rises. Every clink of metal against metal sounds like a gunshot in the still Hawaiian night. They know that if they are caught, the project ends, the guns are confiscated, and the 5th Division goes into the inferno with their standard, slow-firing anchors. But they don't stop. They are driven by a singular, desperate vision of the future. By 3 in the morning, they have 6 ANM-2 receivers laid out on a greasy tarp in a corner of a makeshift maintenance shed. They look like the bones of some prehistoric predator, elegant and lethal. But a receiver is not a gun. It has no trigger. It has no stock. It has no way to be held, aimed, or fired by a human being, standing on his own 2 feet. This is where the true rebellion begins. John Little looks at the pile of steel, and then at Grevich. He knows what comes next. They have less than 10 weeks before the fleet sails for the target. 10 weeks to perform a mechanical miracle that the entire Marine Corps Bureau of Ordnance said was impossible. They have to find a way to mate these high-speed aircraft components with the ergonomics of a rifle. They need parts that don't exist. They need to steal stocks from M1 Garands. They need to weld bipods from BARS. They need to fabricate triggers out of sheet metal and springs. And they have to do it all in secret, without a single piece of paper, a single official requisition, or a single authorized blueprint. They are building a forbidden arsenal. As the first hint of dawn begins to grey the horizon over Camp Tarawa, Grevich covers the parts with a heavy tarp. His hands are stained with the black oil of a dozen dead aircraft, and his eyes are bloodshot from lack of sleep. But for the first time in months, the sound of the slow typewriter in his head is being drowned out by something else. He can almost hear it. The high-pitched, terrifying scream of the Stinger. The sound of 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound of survival. He looks at John Little, and they share a silent, grim understanding. The heist is over. The build is about to begin. They are no longer just a sergeant and a machinist. They are the architects of the monster gun, and they are about to give the Marine Corps a weapon it never asked for, but desperately needs. The clock is ticking toward Iwo Jima, and the first bolt is about to be turned now. The air inside the battalion maintenance shed is a suffocating mixture of ozone, burnt machine oil, and the sharp metallic tang of grinding steel. It is nearly midnight at Camp Tarawa, and while the Pacific breeze rustles the palms outside, inside this corrugated metal sanctuary, the laws of the United States Marine Corps are being systematically dismantled. Sergeant Mel Grevich and Private First Class John Little are hunched over a scarred wooden workbench, their shadows dancing against the walls in the flickering orange light of a single, shielded bulb. Before them lies the skeleton of an ANM-2 aircraft machine gun, stripped of its pride and its aircraft mounts, a raw silver cylinder of high-speed death. This is the birth of a heresy. To the Marine Corps brass, a machine gun is a sacred, standardized instrument, governed by manuals and approved by committees. But to these two men, the manual is a ledger of dead friends, and the only standardization that matters is the rate of fire. Little begins the surgery by removing the spade grips, the twin butterfly triggers that once allowed a rear gunner to track a zero through a plexiglass canopy. He unbolts the rear plate, his movements practiced and surgical, exposing the buffer tube that houses the heavy recoil spring. This is the first engineering obstacle. The ANM-2 was never designed to have a stock. It was meant to be bolted to the vibrating airframe of a Dauntless. Without a stock, the weapon is a bucking bronco that would shatter a man's shoulder and spray bullets at the clouds. Little picks up a discarded M1 Garand stock, a beautiful piece of American walnut that has been salvaged from the scrap heap. He looks at the wood, then at the steel receiver, and then he picks up a wood rasp. The teeth of the file bite into the walnut, sending a fine cloud of sawdust into the air. He is hollowing out the rear of the stock to accept the buffer tube of the machine gun, a process that requires the precision of a watchmaker. If the fit is too loose, the weapon will rattle itself to pieces under the violent recoil of 1,200 rounds per minute. If it is too tight, the first burst will crack the wood like a dry twig. For hours, the only sound in the shed is the rhythmic scuffing of the file and the occasional hiss of a cooling weld. While Little carves the wood, Grevich is focused on the trigger mechanism. The aircraft version of the gun used an electrical solenoid to fire, a system that is useless to a Marine crawling through the mud. Grevich has to build a mechanical bridge between a man's finger and the high-speed firing pin. He fabricates a trigger out of sheet metal and scrap springs, bending the metal with pliers until it fits the lower profile of the new receiver. It is crude, it is raw, but when he pulls it, the sear trips with a clean, mechanical snap. They are building a Franken-gun, a monster stitched together from 3 different weapon systems. To provide stability, they take the heavy steel bipod from a BAR and weld a fabricated adapter plate to the ANM-2's barrel shroud. Now the weapon can be fired from the prone position, but it remains 7 pounds lighter than the standard infantry Browning. It is a sleek, silver Predator, but as the first prototype takes shape, Grevich and Little are forced to confront the technical truth that makes this weapon a suicide pact. This is the cooling paradox. The ANM-2 was designed for the stratosphere, where the air is 40 degrees below zero and moves across the barrel at 300 miles per hour. That slipstream is a massive, invisible heat sink that carries away the thermal energy of 1,200 rounds per minute. But on the ground, in the stagnant, humid air of a Pacific island, that heat sink is gone. The Stinger has no heavy water jacket and no thick cooling fins. It is a thin-walled furnace. Grevich looks at the barrel and knows that if a gunner holds the trigger for more than 5 seconds, the metal will reach its plastic state. The rifling will melt, the barrel will warp, and the weapon will jam permanently, or worse, explode in the gunner's face. This is the Stinger's bite. It offers the highest rate of fire in the world, but it demands absolute cold-blooded discipline. You do not fire the Stinger. You unleash it in short, lethal stabs of lead. 5 rounds, 10 rounds, pause. Let the metal breathe. It is a weapon for a marksman, not a spray-and-pray infantryman. As the night deepens, Little finishes the stock fitment, sliding the walnut over the steel buffer tube with a satisfying, airtight thud. He bolts it into place, and for the first time, the silhouette of the monster is visible. It looks wrong. It looks like something from a nightmare, a hybrid of grace and violence. They add a custom-fabricated ammunition box to the left side, made from sheet metal and designed to hold a 100-round belt. This allows a single Marine to carry and fire the weapon without the need for an assistant gunner to feed the belt. It makes the gunner a self-contained fortress. Grevich picks up a stencil and a small jar of white paint. He carefully brushes the name onto the side of the receiver, Betty Ann. It is a touch of humanity on a machine designed for total erasure. They have 5 more to build and only a few weeks left before the troop ships arrive. The pressure is a physical weight, a constant ticking in the back of their minds. Every time a door slams in the distance, they freeze, expecting the shore patrol to burst in and end the dream. But the MPs never come. The Marine Corps is too busy preparing for the apocalypse to notice 2 men in a shed. By the time the sun begins to rise, the first stinger is complete. Grevich shoulders the weapon, feeling the balance and the weight. It is light, fast, and terrifyingly powerful. He knows that he has created something that the Bureau of Ordnance would never authorize, a weapon that breaks every rule of safety and standardized logistics. But he also knows the math of the beach. He knows that when the ramps drop and the Japanese machine guns start their scream, his men won't be asking for a manual. They will be asking for a way to survive. The Franken-gun is ready. The 6 madmen who will carry them have been chosen. And as the morning light hits the silver barrel of Betty Ann, Grevich realizes that he hasn't just built a gun. He has built a chance. The countdown to Iwo Jima is no longer a march to a slaughterhouse. It is a march to a confrontation. The stinger is born of scrap and desperation, but its bite will be felt across every inch of the volcanic sand now. January 1945. The tropical lushness of Hawaii is now a fading memory, replaced by the salt-crusted air and the claustrophobic confines of a troop transport ship slicing westward through the Pacific. Below decks, in the humid, dimly lit holds of the convoy, the 5th Marine Division is a mass of tension and sharpened steel, but for Sergeant Mel Grevich, the weight of the mission is measured in 6 heavy equipment crates that do not appear on any manifest. Inside these crates, wrapped in oil-soaked canvas and hidden beneath standard issue supplies, lie the stingers. They are the forbidden fruit of a scrapyard rebellion, 6 high-speed monsters that represent a direct challenge to the Marine Corps' doctrine of standardized warfare. The convoy makes its final stop at Tinian, a scarred patch of coral in the Marianas that serves as the dress rehearsal for the apocalypse. Here, under the white-hot glare of the western Pacific sun, the 6 madmen who have been chosen to carry these weapons prepare for the final test. Grevich leads his small group to a remote, jagged section of the coastline, far from the prying eyes of the division's ordnance officers and the shore patrol. They need to know if their Franken-guns will bark or if they will simply shatter in their hands. Grevich picks up Betty Ann, the weight of the aircraft-grade steel and the walnut Garand stock feeling familiar and lethal. Beside him stands Corporal Tony Stein, a toolmaker from Ohio, who looks at the stinger with the analytical eye of a fellow machinist and the predatory grin of a man who knows he is about to unleash hell. They deploy the BAR bipods into the jagged coral and slam home the 100-round boxes. The silence of the island is absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs. Grevich takes a breath, settles his shoulder against the wood, and pulls the trigger. The response is not a weapon. It is a physical event. The stinger does not fire in the slow, rhythmic cadence of the M1919. It screams 1,200 rounds per minute. In the time it takes to exhale, a 10-round burst has already left the barrel, the tracers forming a solid, white-hot line of light that stitches the distant surf into a frenzy of foam and spray. The sound is a high-pitched mechanical howl that echoes off the volcanic rocks, a sound so distinct and so violent that every Marine on the nearby practice range freezes in their tracks. They have never heard anything like it. It isn't a typewriter. It is a chainsaw made of lead. But as the echoes die down, the second part of the stinger's paradox reveals itself. Grevich looks at the barrel and sees the air around it shimmering with a violent heat haze, The thin-walled aircraft steel, stripped of its high-altitude slipstream, is reaching its thermal limit in seconds. A thin wisp of smoke rises from the shroud, and the scent of vaporizing oil fills the air. This is the ambient heat problem. On the ground, in the stagnant, humid air of the Pacific, the Stinger is a weapon of absolute discipline. Grevich turns to the other 5 gunners, his voice low and serious over the roar of the ocean. He tells them the truth. This weapon is a lightning strike, not a sustained barrage. If you hold that trigger for 5 seconds, you are holding a grenade that is melting in your hands. You fire in stabs, short, lethal bursts, 5 rounds, 10 rounds, then let the metal breathe. You are a predator, not a fortress. The gunners nod, their hands gripping the walnut stalks. They are the chosen few, men like Stein, who have the mechanical intuition to manage a temperamental monster. They spend the next 3 days in the volcanic dust of Tinian, learning the rhythm of the Stinger. They learn how to swap the 100-round boxes in total darkness, their fingers memorizing the sharp edges of the fabricated sheet metal mounts. They learn how to compensate for the violent, high-speed recoil that tries to pull the muzzle toward the sky. And they learn to live with the fear of discovery. Every time a staff car or an officer with a clipboard wanders near their section of the camp, the Stingers are hidden beneath tarps, disguised as standard equipment. This is a ghost arsenal, a secret held by a handful of sergeants and machinists who believe that the rules of war are meant to be broken when the price of the rules is the lives of their friends. As the division prepares to board the LSTs for the final leg of the journey, Grevich meticulously cleans every inch of Betty Ann. He knows that the black volcanic sand of their target is unlike anything they have ever faced. It is abrasive, it is fine, and it gets into the soul of a machine. He feng shui the ammunition boxes with layers of grease and canvas, trying to buy his weapon a few more hours of reliability in the salt spray. The atmosphere in the camp has shifted from the nervous energy of training to the cold, quiet focus of the condemned. They know the target now. Iwo Jima, a 8-square-mile rock of sulfur and tunnels where 21,000 defenders are waiting beneath the surface. The intelligence briefings talk about a walkover, about a 74-day naval bombardment that has leveled the island, but Grevich doesn't believe them. He knows that the Japanese haven't been destroyed. They have simply moved underground. He knows that when the ramps drop, it won't be a parade. It will be a slaughterhouse. And in that slaughterhouse, the only thing that will matter is who can put the most lead into the air the fastest. He looks at the crates being loaded onto the transport, each one containing a Stinger and the hopes of a platoon. He thinks of John Little, back at the maintenance shed, the man whose hands built these monsters from the bones of dead planes. He thinks of the names stenciled in white paint on the silver receivers. These weapons are the only honest things left in a world of bureaucracy and bad planning. They are unauthorized, they are dangerous, and they are beautiful. As the fleet finally weighs anchor and turns toward the north, heading for the shadow of Mount Suribachi, Grevich settles into his bunk, the hum of the ship's engines vibrating through his bones. He can still feel the weight of Betty Ann in his hands. He can still hear the high-pitched scream of the 1,200-round-per-minute cycle. He knows that the Stinger's bite is coming, and that the volcanic sand is waiting to test his creation to the point of absolute destruction. The dress rehearsal is over. The secret is out of the crates. And as the horizon begins to show the first dark silhouette of the island, Mel Grevich realizes that he isn't just bringing a gun to a fight, he is bringing a revolution. The countdown to Green Beach has reached its final hours, and the monster gun is about to speak for the first time, in the middle of a volcanic hell now. February 19th, 1945. 0400 hours. The darkness inside the transport ship is absolute, broken only by the dim red glow of the battle lamps. But for the men of the 28th Marine Regiment, the night has already ended.
You are standing in the hold, the smell of grease and diesel fuel thick in your lungs, and your hands are trembling as you perform one final check on the weapon that shouldn't exist. Wrapped in its waterproof canvas is Betty Ann, the 30-pound mechanical heresy that took 3 months of midnight labor to build. You can hear the distant, muffled thunder of the naval bombardment, 16-inch shells from the battleships slamming into the beaches of Iwo Jima. But you know the truth that the briefing officers won't admit.
The bombardment has leveled the surface, but the Japanese are not on the surface. They are beneath it. You climb into the Higgins boat, your boots splashing into the oily bilge water, and settle into your place among 42 other Marines who are staring into the grey pre-dawn mist, with eyes that have already seen too much. At 0830, the engines of the assault waves roar into life, 1,000 diesel hearts beating in unison as the fleet moves toward the shore. The island of Iwo Jima looms ahead, a jagged, sulphurous tooth of volcanic rock dominated by the brooding shadow of Mount Suribachi. To your left and right, the first wave is already hitting Green Beach, and for a few terrifying minutes, there is a silence that feels like a physical weight. No Japanese fire, no response, just the sound of the surf and the grinding of ramps against the sand. You think for a moment that the bombardment worked, that the tunnels are empty, and then the world turns into a slaughterhouse. At 0915, your ramp slams down into the surf. You charge into the black volcanic ash, and immediately you realize that everything you knew about combat has changed. The sand isn't sand. It is a trap of pulverized ash that swallows your boots to the ankles, making every step a grueling struggle against gravity. And then, the Japanese open the shutters. From 500 concealed pillboxes and reinforced bunkers, a wall of lead descends on the beach. It is a crossfire of interlocking fields, a geometric calculation of death that erases the first 3 rows of Marines in a single sustained burst. You dive behind a small ridge of volcanic ash, the heat of the ground vibrating through your uniform. To your right, a standard M1919 machine gun team is trying to set up their weapon. They are struggling with the heavy tripod, their movements frantic as they try to lock the gun into place. Before they can even fire a single shot, a Japanese Nambu gunner from a pillbox 70 yards inland finds them. You watch as the slow, rhythmic chug-chug-chug of the Japanese weapon shreds the American team in less than 10 seconds. They are gone. The system failed them. You reach for the canvas tarp. Your fingers are slick with sweat and volcanic dust as you rip it away to reveal the silver, industrial silhouette of the Stinger. You deploy the BAR bipod, the metal biting into the black sand, and you feel the weight of Betty Ann settle into your shoulder. This is the moment of truth. You identify the pillbox that killed the Browning team, a concrete slit only 6 inches high, nearly invisible in the smoke. You take a breath, smelling the sulfur and the cordite, and you pull the trigger. The sound isn't a weapon. It is a high-pitched, terrifying howl that echoes off the cliffs of Suribachi. 1,200 rounds per minute. In the time it takes for a Japanese gunner to re-index his aim, you have put a 20-round laser of lead directly into his firing port. The tracers are a solid beam of white-hot light, punching through the concrete and silencing the position instantly. The Marines around you freeze, their heads turning toward the sound. They have never heard anything like it. It isn't the slow typewriter of the Browning. It is a chainsaw made of steel. On the right flank, Corporal Tony Stein is unleashing the same mechanical nightmare. Stein has discarded his helmet and his boots, running across the shifting black ash in his socks to gain every ounce of speed. He is a predator in a world of prey. He identifies a bunker, rushes to within 20 yards, and unleashes a 3-second stab of 1,200 RPM fire.
The suppression is so absolute that the Japanese defenders cannot even raise their eyes to look at him. But the Stinger is a hungry monster. You look down and realize your first 100-round box is already empty. You slam home a fresh belt, the metal hot enough to blister your skin. This is the Stinger's bite. You feel the heat radiating off the thin-walled aircraft barrel, the air around it shimmering with a violent thermal haze. You remember Grevich's warning. Short bursts, or the metal will melt. You fire again. 5 rounds, 10 rounds. Pause. Let the metal breathe. Across the beach, the Japanese are shouting in confusion. Through the roar of the mortars, you hear a high-pitched scream from the enemy lines, a sound of alarm and disbelief. They were prepared for the slow cadence of the American infantry, but they weren't prepared for the monster gun. Tony Stein is now on his 4th trip back to the beach.
He is out of ammunition, but he is carrying a wounded Marine on his shoulders, his face a mask of ash and sweat. He drops the man at the aid station, grabs 2 more boxes of aircraft-grade .30 caliber rounds, and charges back into the kill zone. He does this 8 times. 8 trips through a corridor of fire that should have killed him a dozen times over. Each time, the Stinger leads the way. Each time, the high-pitched scream of the ANM-2 provides the umbrella of lead that allows the rifle squads to advance another 10 yards. By 1400 hours, the 28th Marines have done the impossible. They have pushed through the terraces and cut the island in half, isolating Mount Suribachi from the rest of the Japanese army. You are slumped against a jagged piece of coral, your lungs burning and your hands shaking from the vibration of the gun. You look at Betty Ann. The white paint stenciling her name is scorched and bubbling.
The barrel shows a slight, ominous heat warp along its length, and the receiver is caked in the fine, abrasive dust of the volcano. But she is still here. You have fired more rounds in 5 hours than a standard machine gun team fires in an entire campaign. The unauthorized weapon, built in a secret shed by a sergeant and a machinist, has just become the most effective tool of survival on the deadliest beach in the Pacific. As the sun begins to set, casting long, bloody shadows over the wreckage of Green Beach, you know the battle is only beginning. There are 21,000 defenders still waiting in the tunnels, and the mountain is still ahead. But as you listen to the distant, rhythmic thudding of the standard guns, you realize that the Stinger has changed the math of the war. The monster gun has awakened, and as long as the barrels hold and the ammunition lasts, the Japanese will have to face a fire that burns faster than anything the Marine Corps ever authorized now. March 1st, 1945. The shadow of Mount Suribachi has shifted from a destination to a tomb, and the sulfuric rain of Iwo Jima is washing the blood of a generation into the black volcanic sand. By the time the second flag was raised into the smoky Pacific sky, the 6 modified Stingers were already dying. They had fought for 3 grueling days, their thin-walled aircraft barrels screaming at 1,200 rounds per minute. But the laws of physics and the unrelenting thermal stress were finally winning the war of attrition. One by one, the monsters failed. The thin steel, never meant for the stagnant heat of ground combat, warped under the pressure. Receivers cracked, and the improvised triggers, born of scrap metal and desperation, snapped after thousands of high-speed cycles. By February 26th, the last Stinger went silent.
Mel Grevich, the man who had dreamed them into existence in a Hawaiian maintenance shed, laid his weapon aside and picked up a standard M1 Garand rifle. He had done his job. He had given his Marines a 72-hour window of absolute tactical superiority, and that window had saved dozens of men that the Bureau of Ordnance had already written off as acceptable losses. But the story of the Stinger had one final tragic chapter to write. On March 1st, Corporal Tony Stein, the Dayton toolmaker who had used his Stinger to shred 20 pillboxes on D-Day, volunteered to lead a 19-man patrol into the jagged ridges of the northern sector. He was no longer carrying his monster gun. It had disintegrated in his hands days earlier, its barrel a twisted ruin of heat-stressed steel. He was carrying a standard weapon now, moving through the lethal labyrinth of caves and spider holes.
A single sniper's bullet found him, and in an instant, one of the greatest technical and tactical minds of the Pacific War was extinguished. Tony Stein was only 23 years old. Exactly 1 year later, on a cold February morning in 1946, his widow stood in a ceremony in Ohio to receive the Medal of Honor. The citation was read aloud, immortalizing Stein's courage, his 8 trips across the beach, and his devastating use of a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon. Those 2 words, personally improvised, would become the permanent, simplified record of the war. To the world, Tony Stein was a lone genius who had built a miracle in his spare time. The names of Mel Grevich and John Little were never mentioned. There was no mention of the 3 months of secret midnight labor at Camp Tarawa. There was no mention of the 6 identical weapons distributed across the regiment to save the lives of an entire battalion.
History, in its need for a singular, easy hero, had erased the architects to celebrate the warrior. Mel Grevich didn't protest. He didn't write letters to the Department of the Navy or seek out historians to claim his share of the glory. He was a Marine sergeant, not a lobbyist for his own legacy. He returned to the quiet, snow-covered woods of Minnesota, took a job, and lived a life of profound, humble silence. John Little moved to California, built houses, and kept his memories of the scrapyard rebellion locked away. They were the survivors, and in the culture of the greatest generation, survival was its own reward. The medals belonged to those who never came home. The Marine Corps eventually studied the Stinger concept, but their conclusion was cold and logistical. They recognized the power, but they feared the fragility. They couldn't guarantee a supply of aircraft barrels to the front lines, and they couldn't train every Marine to have the mechanical discipline of a Grevich or a Stein. They stuck with the slow, heavy M1919 until the war was won. It would take decades before the lessons of the Stinger, the need for high-speed fire and man-portable power, would find their way into the design of the M60 machine gun. Today, not a single original Stinger remains. They were never registered, never given serial numbers, and never returned to a formal armory. They were battle-damaged debris, likely buried by bulldozers in the black ash of Iwo Jima, or tossed into the deep Pacific as the fleet sailed home. Modern researchers from the Canadian Historical Arms Museum spent 3 months just trying to build a single working replica, proving that what Grevich and Little built with hand tools was a miracle of engineering. The Stinger existed for 90 days, fought for 72 hours, and changed the math of the deadliest beach in American history before vanishing into the shadows of the past. But the absence of the steel does not mean the absence of the truth. We are left with the image of 2 men in a shed, surrounded by stolen parts and flickering light, deciding that the system was wrong and they were right. They proved that innovation isn't something that happens in a committee. It is something that happens in the soul of a man who refuses to watch his brothers die on the black sand.